Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Mateo, and I serve as Deputy Director of Programs and Partnerships at Carnegie Council. To begin, I'd like to welcome you all to our third event in the Council's Ethics Empowered Leadership and Practice series, which convenes scholars and practitioners to discuss pressing moral issues, reflect on their careers, and offer insights to young leaders. In today's panel, we will be addressing the crucial question of how can nations collaborate to ensure the rights of people moving due to climate change? It is my pleasure to now introduce our moderator for this event, Jana Lukasz, a member of the faculty at Hunter College High School and an advisory board member for our Next Generation Leadership Initiative. We're also honored to welcome our panelists, Dan Boscavelin, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Pratt Institute, alongside Ilgu Osler, Professor of Political Science at SUNY New Paltz. Before I pass the microphone to Jana, a reminder that towards the end of the program, we will have a brief Q&A with the panelists. For those in person, we will have microphones go around. For those joining us virtually, please submit your questions to our panelists directly via the chat feature. Following the event, our team will publish the full event as a video, podcast, and transcript, alongside additional educational resources and discussion questions that can be leveraged in the classroom. As we convene in Carnegie Council's Global Ethics Hub in New York City, I want to welcome you again and will now pass the program over to Jana.
Thank you, Brian. So over the last decade, climate migration has been on the rise. Estimates from the World Bank put the number of climate migrants within their countries to be between 44 million to 216 million people by the year 2050. Although currently most climate migrants stay within their own country, those who are forced to leave their country are often individuals who face a very dangerous journey, going through multiple countries, possibly facing exploitation. Climate migration presents a distinct global scale challenge that goes to the heart of the moral case for both sovereignty and human rights. Rising global temperatures and a shift in climate patterns have rapidly increased the number of climate migrants. As all countries contend with this rise in population shift and climate effects, we need to contemplate how countries can collaborate while facing the competing pressures of the effects of climate change and at the same time ensure migrants' human rights. This session, as Brian mentioned in his earlier remarks, feature two distinguished experts reflecting on the state of climate migration today and considerations for the future. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to thank everyone who's in the room with us today, especially on this rainy, miserable day, and also for those of you who are with us online. Also, all of your students, who I'm really thrilled to see young faces. So I'd like to open our conversation by asking each of you, Ilgu and Dan, to briefly describe the state of climate migration today and measures that have been taken to help address the issue. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Do you want me to go first? Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. I thank the council for the invitation and Brian and Jana for organizing us. Well, there is no real single way to assess the situation right now, right? So the main point that I want to make today that I want to share with everyone is that we don't have an overarching definition for who is a climate migrant. We don't have a way to measure who is a climate migrant, let alone a policy for who's a climate migrant at the global scale. So that creates a very difficult position in determining what the situation is. But we can look at this in notions of buckets. So in the context of the International Organization for Migration, they define a climate migrant as a person or group forced to leave their home due to climate change-related environmental changes, either suddenly or slowly, like gradually. So that's the general definition that IOM gives. IOM is the Organization for Migration, and somehow in the international realm, people who are displaced due to climate fall under their realm. Now, having said this, there is, in the world of displacement, if you're displaced as somebody who is suffering from a climate-induced event like a hurricane, right? And you're displaced into another part of your country, you're an internally displaced person, and that falls under the humanitarian realm of the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, UNHCR. And OCHA, Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, coordinates all these agencies to ensure that these people have their basic needs. So that's the humanitarian response end of how you treat this issue. Now, people who cross over borders, on the other hand, when they cross over a border because they're displaced due to climate, they don't have any rights, they don't have any position in the international realm. So they're at the behest of the host country, whether to welcome them or turn them away, or whether to temporarily house them or send them back, right? So this is all in the sovereignty system that you're talking about. There has been, so that's a second bucket where there are people who don't have, if you cross a border, you're out of luck. It's happenstance. There are countries like the United States that have historically extended temporary protective status to people who might be in danger if they go back to their homes due to environmental reasons. But that's temporary, and that's a protected status. That's not a right to stay in a place. Now, planned relocations, as well as unplanned permanent displacement to another country, these are very different from one another. There have been some planned relocations, very few of those. Australia and Tuvalu are kind of now talking about this. And and then New Zealand at some point said they were going to issue a visa program for Kiribati, and then they reversed that. So again, at the behest of the state, and then also the government that is running that state, that might change their mind. On the legal front, we have had some promising developments recently. The International Court of Justice decision that came out came out in June, I believe. Are you going to talk about that? Should I not talk about it?
Go for it.
Okay. And I'm not an legal expert, so I'm just going to refer to that decision as a promising decision that actually says that if a person is displaced due to climate and those individuals don't feel safe going back to their country because their life might be endangered, they should be treated under non-refoulement, which is the legal aspect of the UN Refugee Convention that allows for somebody to seek asylum that is under very specific circumstances, but this non-refoulement language in the International Court of Justice's advisory decision can open up new arenas for perhaps a strategy in seeking court-based decision-making to open up international law to climate refugees per se. And then there is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Maybe we can talk about that in some other context. So I won't go into that now.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is really helpful, and we have some overlap in our thoughts about this. So first, I want to thank the organizers for having me. This is just a really lovely space, and I think a really important conversation to be having. So I appreciate you convening it. I also just wanted to start out by saying, although I really appreciate the kind introduction, that I don't consider myself an expert per se in this topic for a couple of reasons. So part of that is just acknowledging my own positionality here as kind of like a white U.S. citizen who has not had to navigate these systems in the same way that other people have, right? So there's just inherently going to be knowledge that like actual migrants have that I don't. And I think that is often important for these kinds of things. So insofar as a philosophy professor who gets to sort of like think about things that I think matter, I wanted to sort of like use the resources and opportunities that I have to try and think through what I take to be sort of like one of the central challenges of our time. So with that little asterisk, as we've already sort of gotten into a little bit, I think climate migration is kind of an inherently slippery concept, right? There are occasional cases where it's like very clear that somebody is forced to move just as a result of climate impacts, right? You have low-lying island states where if you go past a certain threshold, right, you have enough sea level rise that they will be displaced. But the large majority of cases where people are in one way or another being pushed to move by climate change are much more ambiguous, right? Tends to be a mix of factors where you have, you could have like long-term changes to weather patterns that make agriculture more difficult, but it's also affected by local policy choices and like poverty, and different kinds of adaptive capacities. So it's often very difficult to say with sort of like absolute certainty, this person is a climate migrant, right? And often people who are pushed to move as a result of climate change may not see themselves in that light, right? So this poses particular challenges. As Elgu mentioned, we don't have an international framework that gives you a definition, let alone a way of conferring specific rights to people based on being displaced as a result of climate forcings. But there are challenges to trying to even conceive of like how one would prove that, right? So I want to just be clear that when I'm talking about climate migration here, I'm just referring to cases where climate change has played, let's say, a substantial role in pushing people to move, right? We've also seen this is, because this is difficult to quantify, you get estimates that are all over the map in terms of how much is currently happening and how much is likely to happen in the future. You threw out the World Bank's number, which was like 50 to 250 million people by 2050. But there were other estimates that go up to like 750 million people, right?
I have a 1.2 billion.
Yeah, so
right here.
Right. So
I saw that number too.
And again, this is partly due to uncertainties at various levels, like including like our mapping of where people live in zones that are sort of close enough to the coast that they could be inundated, et cetera. There are resources that give good information about the strengths and weaknesses of the data that we have. So you mentioned the IOM and also the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. So the IOM has something called the Global Migration Data Portal that goes through a lot of the kind of like caveats involved in trying to wrap your head around this if you're interested in sort of getting into the weeds about it. Generally, it's easier to capture sort of like shorter term disaster related internal migration than it is to capture cross-border migration due to longer term environmental changes. But we can say, despite all that ambiguity, a few things with confidence, right? We know that climate change is already an important driver of displacement, with disasters like floods and storms displacing at least 32 million people in 2022 globally, which accounts for more than half of internal displacement. And that is likely to become an increasingly central factor in both internal migration and cross-border migration as the climate crisis worsens. Most climate migration is shorter term and internal at this point. We can talk about some of the factors that go into that. As we've already discussed, there have been some efforts to address this reality, primarily in the form of regional free movement agreements. So I'll mention also East Africa's protocol on free movement of persons, which includes some language about climate, as well as individual state policies. Although, as you also mentioned, those can come and go, right? So briefly, there were some Scandinavian countries that had language about including climate change and environmental harms in their considerations for admission, and then they got rid of those in 2015. But for the moment, climate change is largely kind of in the background of popular discussions about migration, and there isn't really that much happening. That you mentioned the ICJ ruling, but overall there are a few exceptions to what I just said, but they're generally not actually especially heartening exceptions. If you're thinking about like who's actually thinking about this problem and doing something about it, it's really primarily military strategists and people who are involved in and profiting from private detention and surveillance. They're very much on this issue, and regardless of what administrations come and go and what they say they believe about climate change, they are doing that work because they understand what is coming, right? So this is in some ways similar to the way in which you can think of, and I suspect they actually probably have better data available to them than we do, in the same way that that Exxon scientists, let's say, in the 1970s, correctly predicted exactly how much climate change we would have right now, like on the dot, and they were using this in their internal projections, thinking about like when are we going to be able to access all this oil that's currently under the ice up there, right? Okay. There are a few things to be hopeful about too. The one that I would stress is the climate movement's growing internationalism and convergence with other movements, in particular immigration justice movements and anti-ICE protests, as well as sort of like connecting the dots with the Palestine solidarity movement. I think environmentalism in general has kind of like a checkered history of understanding that environmental harms are inextricably bound up with social injustices. So you can think of guys like Garrett Hardin, who's famous for the idea of the tragedy of the commons and like lifeboat ethics, unrepentant white supremacist and just like factually groundless thing, but picked up in a lot of environmental philosophy. So I think this spreading awareness of the interconnected character of those struggles is really important and something that, at least for me, gives me hope.
Thank you. So Dan, you had just mentioned that East Africa had been working a little bit on this. Scandinavian countries kind of tipped their toe in and then came back. How do both of you think that countries can best deal with climate change and the rise of migration internally and externally? Like if you were able to advise, what would you advise countries to possibly?
I'm going to let you take that one.
Well, I'm going to add.
I'll give you a little. I'll give you a little question.
One more thing that I'm going to add is one of the important declarations is the Cartagena Declaration that actually is the Latin American countries have had, and that declaration, along with some of the African regional declarations, extends the definition of refugee generally to people who have cause of seriously fearing going back due to public disturbance. So public disturbance can be interpreted as any kind of climate-related event too. So, but its implementation has been spotted. So it's kind of piecemeal. Again, we know that sovereignty trumps it all. It's at the behest of the state. Even if we come up with a general, wonderful, fantastic, overarching how to deal with this, right? So now you're asking the question of climate change. How do we deal with climate change and migration internally and externally?
It's a little question.
How many, and you have what? Like how much time do we have?
12 hours.
All right. So, well, it's a huge question, right? So on the climate front, I would say some countries are better equipped to deal with it than others. We know that European countries have been trying to have this energy transition. They are spending trillions of dollars in this energy transition, have this giant plan to do that. So there is mitigation efforts on the European front. The US had a big plan that was kind of abandoned, but I don't know what's happening with that. I don't follow US as much. But I would say that the small island and developing states are ones that are the most amazing to follow because they're not just asking for the international community to do things, but they're also walking the walk. They are really doing mitigation and adaptation on their island states, right? Fiji has, for example, a planned relocation program that they've been doing, but then they're also welcoming other citizens from small island states. So in a way, how do you deal with climate change the best way? I mean, you have to fulfill your obligations as a state to the Paris Climate Agreement. I would say, I would recommend that they actually not only meet their obligations for Paris, but surpass it, because Paris Agreement does not go far enough in demanding states to transition their economies. The national action plans for adaptation to climate needs financing. The financing falls short in that front. The National Adaptation Fund that was created under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change promised something like $230 million per year for adaptation, when we know UN Environment Program says that the gap for adaptation is $250 billion with a B. So this is like what the international community from the global north has promised global south in adaptation plans, is a drop in the bucket. It's really nothing. The EU has a promise of $300 billion, but that money is for green transitions, which is a mitigation effort, not an adaptation effort. So as far as adapting to climate change, which is coming, we don't see actually the adaptation going on. And the quote that you had as far as the numbers that you were quoting from the World Bank, the 246 million additional displacement due to climate change, I read that as additional people who are migrating, so migrating across borders. And they also say that if states fulfill their obligations under the Paris Agreement, they can actually cut that number by about 80%, right? So that means that if states really do fulfill their obligations for mitigation and adaptation under the Paris Agreement, we would not have as much pressure in climate migration and climate mobility. People who live in the global south, in their communities, they don't want to move. People who live in the global north, in their communities, they don't want to move. They want adaptation if they can live where they do, because they're happy where they are. That's where they live, that's their communities. So in a way, if there are solutions where people are, that's the way to deal with climate change and migration. Let's help people where they are. And that only can take place effectively if we have a human rights-based, non-reactive policy framework where it involves the communities themselves in actually responding to their own problems, and then the resources are provided to them. Going back to what Dan was talking about earlier, saying that, we don't know. Like me as a person who has not been through climate displacement or climate pressure in my community, I don't know what they need. We should not, press that. So I would say, first of all, human rights-based approaches is the most important in developing the policies around this, and making sure that the multilateral framework is not top-down, but it is bottom-up as well.
Good. Well, Dan, off of that then, do you think that having a human rights-based approach is the most under-discussed kind of ethical question related to climate migration, or do you think there might be something else?
That's a tough question. So I I want to just say first that I agree very much with the idea that this needs to be at the level of what's actually like owed to people internationally. So this is not just about sort of benevolence, but it's about people's rights. Since my specialization is in philosophy around this sort of stuff, I will say I think a number of philosophers have done really excellent work in trying to think through aspects of this problem, but I would say that those contributions are fairly fragmentary, and often climate isn't like the primary focus. So I think mainstream philosophical frameworks for thinking about migration are generally kind of like ill-suited to accurately capture the ethics of migration for a few interrelated reasons. So one is that they just take the validity of extensive discretion over immigration controls for granted. So a philosopher named Joseph Cairns calls this the conventional view on migration, where we just sort of like assume that states, as part of their sovereignty, can just decide who comes in and not, right? And I think that climate change in various ways calls aspects of the way that we think about sovereignty into question, or at least it sort of highlights problems that were already there in starker relief. So you mentioned the efforts of small island states to, do their mitigation part too. There's a great documentary called "The Island President" about the Maldives and President Mohammed Nasheed of the Maldives and his attempt to sort of do this. But it's a tragic story in some respects, because he's a democracy activist. They managed to finally get rid of this dictatorship and institute democracy in the Maldives, and then he has his first cabinet meeting and realizes that the country is sinking, right? It's about to be underwater. And so they're trying to figure out what they can do, and they're holding conferences in scuba gear underwater to try and raise the media profile for this. But the reality is, of course, it's great that they are putting putting solar panels on their own buildings and saying, look, if we can do it, you can too. But the Maldives is it's less than a drop in the bucket of global emissions, right? They could go way carbon negative and it wouldn't make a difference. So it's not. Whether or not their country exists in 100 years is not up to them, right? So in that context, when you're talking about sovereignty, you have to ask yourself, what are we really talking about here, right? When you're talking about democracy, you have to ask yourself, what does that mean in this context, right? So that's the first thing I want to say. I think that this is connected to a kind of sanitizing or idealizing that often happens in the ethical literature. So just for example, philosophers like Philip Cole and Sarah Fine have both pointed out the conspicuous absence of race in the philosophical literature on immigration, despite the central reality of racism to the development of modern immigration controls and its continuing, if disavowed, racist character. So I would suggest, for example, Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds' book, Drawing the Global Color Line, but also James Whitman's really, I think, disturbing book, Hitler's American Model, is excellent in pointing to the ways in which the Nazis actually looked to U.S. immigration policy for inspiration for the Nuremberg laws, right? And that there's an extensive record of this. Those were at the time explicitly based on racial categories and eugenic ideas of how to preserve the purity of the nation. That became less PC in polite company, but to just sort of bracket it completely and be like, okay, well, yes, excluding people based on race is not acceptable, but having said that, we're now going to talk about the ethics of immigration without ever talking about this ever again. Seems like a kind of backwards way to do this, right? And in fact, it's not just that those policies are racist themselves, but that borders actually are part of what produces racialization, right? It's a way of dividing populations among themselves and putting them in relation, in a hierarchical relationship. So Harsha Walia's book, Border and Rule, is a good book on that. Okay, there's more that I can say, but so I think basically if you were going to ask me what is the most underdiscussed ethical question related to climate migration, I'd probably say something like, how might specific historical and structural relationships produce or underline our obligations to climate migrants? I think that this calls attention to the ways in which the existing ethical literature just kind of covers that over. It engages in a kind of like formalism that I think ultimately enables a lot of the problematic things that we're seeing today, including the weaponization of the language of of anti-sexism and anti-racism in defense of white supremacy. So where we're like, oh, we can't have affirmative action because it discriminates against white people or whatever it is, right? So there's a formalism there that doesn't take into account the actual historical realities and complexities of the situation, that ultimately prevents us from having any kind of realistic ethical treatment of the problem. That's all I'll say.
I'm like, ah. So then, Ildu, you mentioned though that the EU has kind of bucketed off about $300 billion, you said, for mitigation, is that right?
For global spending, global South
For
spending.
global South, okay.
Yeah.
So I know that also the EU has been looking at climate change, has been kind of really focused on this. You have the European Green New Deal. My question though is how then does the EU not become a green fortress? So they're going to be looking at this. So how do they kind of not be this fortress that then actually builds on more vulnerable global South states?
Yeah, I mean, EU Green New Deal does not take into consideration migration, right? I think the term migration in the entire document is like mentioned once or something. And it is a green transition plan. It's an adaptation plan, but it is for Europe and Europeans. And they're spending, like in the next gen, when I was doing my work in Spain, I know that the next gen plan was spending about $69 billion just in Spain for COVID transition. And most of it was going to be on technology, on green stuff. But again, that doesn't include any of the migrants. It doesn't include any migration questions. It's not, I mean, climate migration is not part of the European Green New Deal focus area. Europe has not necessarily been open to this. There has been actually apparently one case in Italy that was approved based on climate displacement. So that's kind of like held as an example. That might actually create some litigation. A lot of organizations are going to be going the litigation route to try to get some clear language on climate displaced people to have those rights for seeking refuge in another country, right? Some kind of visa, even if you don't want to call it refugee. And let me clarify that here. Now, 1951 Refugee Convention gives rights to seek asylum for people who are persecuted in their own countries because of their political beliefs, their religious belonging, their social, like some social category that they belong to, or that they are, ideologically not. And then if the state is not willing to protect them, or state is targeting them because of those characteristics, then they can seek asylum in another country. And the international law says that states should not turn away those people who say they need to seek asylum. That space has been narrowly interpreted by those people who work in that community, and they have been very protective of that community. And if you look, in 2018, there was a high-level meeting at the United Nations between the states. And in that high-level meeting, there was supposed to be a declaration on migrants and refugees. There was a push to divide the discussion on migrants and refugees, and we have two declarations. One declaration on refugees and the other declaration on migrants, because the refugee space did not want to be confused with the migrant space. Because migrants, people who cross borders, as it could be economic, it could be climate, it could be whatever. You want to go see your father. That is not an allowable crossing border, right? If you are an asylum seeker, a refugee, you fit into the 1951 convention. Now, when we use the term climate refugee, right, that makes the refugee folks think, oh my God, if they're going to reopen this discussion about who is a refugee, we might lose ground in what we already have. Because we already know that even if you have this notion of non-refoulement, you should not send somebody back because they are fearful of their, states constantly are violating this. And they're not necessarily fulfilling their obligation. Not all states, right? Many states are, I mean, if you look at many states in the global south, people cross borders and live in those countries for many years, right? I mean, if you, in some cases, for 30 years. An average refugee, I believe, is, I mean, don't quote me on this, but because I didn't put that number here, but I think that average refugee is about 20 years now. So if you think about refugee status was supposed to be something temporary. You're fearful for going back to your house, the complex emergency, the political situation in your household is going to be okay, and now you're going to go back, right? And we can think of this similarly for climate. We think that climate change, if you're displaced because of a hurricane, you should be able to go back, but maybe not. This is why there is planned relocations. I mean, they're already moving people from small island states to Australia or to Fiji, another small island state. Actually, they like to call themselves the big ocean states, not small island states, because they do, I mean, if you look at the mass of those countries in the ocean realm, and one of the promising things, like, I mean, just like we need to have one upbeat thing to say, right? So those people who are losing their land, and they're like, if their island goes under the water, International Court of Justice's advisory opinion actually says that those people, even if the land is gone, they don't lose their right to the ocean, right? So citizens of Tuvalu will still have the rights to that ocean space. So that big ocean space actually, big ocean state is a very good terminology to use for those countries at this point, especially if the islands are gone. So I guess, yeah.
Glad there was something positive. Dan, based on your expertise, what do you think the best ways are to address misinformation about climate migrants? We'll add climate refugees now, even though someone might be upset. What do you think?
So if it's all right with you, I'm going to sort of like try to tie this back to what I was trying to get at a moment ago in sort of a convoluted way, which is that I think that it's important for us to have sort of like general philosophical commitments and principles. But I also think it's really important for us to recognize the kinds of specific obligations that we have to each other that grow out of like our actual intertwined histories and our various kinds of positions in a global system that philosopher Olufemi Taiwo calls global racial empire, right? And so I'll just like, to give some examples of that, if you imagine that some folks who are internally displaced by the recent Hurricane Melissa, which is still barreling through the Atlantic as we speak, which hit Jamaica yesterday as I think the second strongest storm ever to make landfall. So like let's imagine that it's already killed over 30 people, many of them in Haiti actually, for reasons that we can talk about. Imagine that some of these people find that they're not able to rebuild the life that they had and that they need to move, right? Imagine people don't forget about, but set aside the islands themselves disappearing. Like let's say that they just lose the coral reefs, which is what's happening right now, right? At 1.5 degrees Celsius, we lose most of the world's coral reefs, which house a quarter of all marine biodiversity, but they also are crucial to the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, right, in coastal areas. And so let's say the reefs disappear, right, and your way of life becomes impossible, and you have to move, right? If somebody from let's say from Jamaica or Haiti comes to the U.S., is our responsibility to them purely humanitarian, or would we have to also take into account the long colonial histories of those places that produce the kinds of vulnerability, or are integral to producing the kinds of vulnerability that push people to move, right? So, through the middle of the 20th century, Jamaica was one of the most internally economically unequal places in the entire world, right? Because of the long legacy of first extermination of indigenous peoples and then of chattel slavery, producing sugar and other goods for European markets, made a couple of slave-owning wealthy elites tremendously wealthy, and everybody else just barely scraping by, right? And those things are not, it's not like those things just happened in the past and they don't impact the present, right? You can look at those maps of colonial exploitation, of neo-colonial pressure through structural adjustment policies and neoliberal, straitjacketing. They map on perfectly to maps of climate vulnerability, right? So insofar as that is the case, it's great to say, okay, like we have general kind of humanitarian responsibilities to people that we should meet. But I think that often those kinds of arguments come across as fairly abstract. I think it's crucial that people actually hear from migrants themselves and that they understand their relationship to those people, right? That they see them as other people and they understand that our lives and their lives are not actually separate from each other, right? That our lives only look the way that they do because their lives look the way that they do. That's just to say, I think we need to tell the truth, but I do also think we need to do it in a careful way, right? So I think that climate denialism and the demonization of migrants often are protective responses that are, at least in part, meant to deflect a perceived threat to privilege or a suggestion of culpability or responsibility to have to change something, right? It's the same reason that the American right really wants to get rid of critical race theory and to erase the history of genocide and slavery in this country, right? They don't want people to know about that because then you might actually feel some sort of responsibility to people to do something about it. So we need to tell the truth about that stuff, but I think in an accessible and inviting way based on common ground. So that doesn't mean just like pandering to racists or jumping on the bandwagon of xenophobia, but it also means that we shouldn't gatekeep or just castigate ordinary people as being racist or whatever. I want to emphasize that like this isn't about blaming normal people. It's about the obligations that arise out of our distinct positions within that global structure. So I would want to keep the focus on who's profiting from this situation, right? The tech firms that are profiting from it, the weapons manufacturers, the private prisons, the far-right politicians who want to gin up fear, rather than on the ordinary people who just sort of like find themselves in this situation. But I think it is crucial to emphasize to them that they're not living in a vacuum.
Helgu, do you think that there are specific best practices or ways to address misinformation on this topic?
Wow, that's a question that I did not think about. So let me think about this. I mean, I think that what's most important in my mind about misinformation is that we need to be able to translate scientific knowledge about climate change and then also migration and mobility into everyday language and make it accessible. And we need to demand our leaders to communicate that that knowledge based on science as opposed to fiction. And also expect education at all levels on these issues, right? So I think that, I was part of an organization that was demanding that there be climate education from kindergarten on. And this was not part of UN's agenda, and we were trying to get sneak language into the documents to ensure, because they always talked about youth education, but never about children's education on climate. And by the time you're youth, you have framed your thought process anyway about these issues. And then also at all levels. And then there is also the issue of demanding elected officials provide accurate and timely information about climate impacts. And for this, the Sustainable Development Goal 17 becomes very key. In countries like the United States, it's a matter of will, but in countries that are, they can't necessarily have the ability to collect all that information, they might need the resources to be able to do that, right? So in all of this, resources become a really important factor. And I want to also add one thing to what you were talking about as far as kind of obligations. And today, I'm just going to go back to our class discussion today. In my class, we're talking about climate, and one of the things that we were talking about is in the development of Paris Agreement, right? The non-governmental world historically was always, when going into these UN framework conventions and Conference of Parties, they used to be talking about the science of climate change. Like, we have to mitigate. And the second they switched to understanding this issue from the perspective of adaptation and just transitions, they became more allied with those states that are facing threat from climate change. And they have become stronger allies in a way for this kind of change, right? What we see then is, in this context, in the Paris Agreement, the global north wanted to make adaptation and loss and damage the same thing, right? But that was rejected. So going back to your question about who is owed what, at least the language of loss and damage was included in, even though it's not very clear, it's not pointing responsibility to who did what to whom. The language of loss and damage is in the framework convention that allows for further discussion about who owes what to whom, maybe in the future. Yeah. So there is, again, I'm always the glass half full person, that where can we find those margins so that we can move the needle a little forward on this, even though I totally recognize these hurricanes are getting faster and faster, and we need to move faster and faster in our responses too. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Alex for a question.
I think we'll do audience.
Audience first? Excellent. Okay, I will start up front.
My name is Kevin Bach. I'm from a junior at Drew University. My question comes, I know it's probably not phrased by the international community yet, or defined, but when does when does someone become a climate refugee in your eyes? I know, for example, Dan, you had brought up coral reefs when they start being eroded, it causes more flooding. So can someone be considered a climate refugee when they're fleeing? The writing's on the wall, there's going to be flooding, and they're fleeing that. Or is it better to define someone as a climate refugee of the flood already happened, their home's destroyed, and now they can't return to their home? How would you personally define that?
Great question. Do you want to take it
No,
first?
I'll go after you.
Okay. Yeah, so I think part of the reason that I was speaking in terms of climate migration rather than in terms of climate refugees, I think there's arguments for different approaches here, right? So one way of thinking about it would be to say, okay, if we can come up with a criterion that says, like, if you check these boxes, you'll count as a refugee under the Refugee Convention, and you'll have all the protections, such as they are these days, of that framework, right? There are, I think, some concerns about trying to do it that way. So one is, as you mentioned, the actual, like, in practice, like, meeting of those responsibilities by states is sort of not trending in a great direction. And I will mention, one of the things that I haven't really talked about is the way in which the borders themselves have changed, right? So it's not just sort of like a line on a map, you put a fence there and that's your border, right? If you're the United States or Europe now, you have lots of, you're training immigration enforcement in countries in, like, various kinds of, like, buffer zones between your country and them, to make sure that you actually don't have people arriving on your shores in the first place claiming asylum, right? So regardless of the various kinds of flouting of bipartisan flouting of international law that happens, like, they're just trying to make sure that people actually, like, don't get here in the first place to be able to claim those protections. And that's a massive business, right? I think that if you create that category too stringently, you're going to exclude most of the people who are actually being harmed by climate change, to the extent that their existing ways of life are becoming, in one way or another, unmanageable, right? Just because it's very hard to prove that, to just be like, okay, over a 20-year period, my crops have declined X amount, and to tie that to, like, the emissions of a particular state or whatever it is, right? So it might be possible to formulate that. People have tried to do it. I am wary of taking that approach, because I think rather than sort of, like, trying to say, okay, you're only, like, count officially as a climate migrant if you have, if you show up with, your possessions on your back or whatever, right? We should be thinking about the ways in which climate change is part of a larger story of the extraction of wealth and labor from some parts of the world for the benefit of other parts of the world, right? Climate change and the poverty and the inequality that we're talking about, they don't just exist, right? They're generated by the same processes. And I think when you look at things through that lens, it becomes a little bit less important to say, okay, this person is a climate migrant and not an economic migrant, right? And you're able to say, actually, there's this whole range of historical legacies and ongoing policies that have contributed to undermining your way of life and making it so that you don't feel like you can stay where you are, right? What can we do to change that? That, I think, is sort of the fundamental question for me. I realize that doesn't address the more sort of, like, direct question of, how should states define this? So maybe it's a bit of a cop-out, but
I mean, okay, there are two ways to answer this question. What is doable and what I would want to see, right? Which one do you want? That's, I mean, what I would like to see is, like, okay, so we have an international system that allows for financing, goods, money, everything to move around freely, used to. I mean, it's changing a little bit now, right? The liberal order. But it never allowed for humans to move around freely from point A to point B. Most people in the world don't want to move. They're happy where they are. But other people want to move. And they, Hirschman wrote in Exit, Voice, and Loyalty is like, you're going to succeed if people can vote with their feet, right? They can just leave if they're not happy in a place. So in a way, I think that I am one of those people. In the ideal world, we would be able to move to wherever we want, whenever we want. Most likely we would stay where we are, because that's what most people do. They grow up and they live in where they are. But having said that, in reality, okay, we have this sovereign system, and sovereignty is not going anywhere anytime soon right now, right? The World Federalist Movement is not that strong. So we are going to see that sovereignty is going to trump everything that comes in its way. So we need to convince states to extend those rights. I think that, I mean, that was the effort, the Model International Mobility Convention. Can I pull this out? Is that okay? So this was an effort, and Carnegie Council is housing this now. Professor Michael Doyle and a group of experts have gotten together and written a mobility convention that gives rights to people who cross borders, right? If you are a refugee, or if you are a laborer, or if you are an undocumented person, when you cross the border, what are your rights? And those rights are what we should start from. I come from the human rights world, so I think that if we grant basic rights to all humans, we can overcome 90% of our problems, right? So, and in this document, a forced migrant is defined as, you know, a person owing to a serious harm if they return back to their homeland. And this gives the rights for that person to seek asylum. Now, the solution that, I mean, so again, I think that at the very basic realm, if somebody says, I fear going back to my country because there is a famine, or because there is, I mean, does it matter that famine was because of climate, or because that there was actually a misdistribution based on a dictator who is not letting food get through the humanitarian corridors, right? Does that matter if that person is going to face starvation if they go back to where they are? So I'm just wondering about, like, if we are really couching these questions about who should be acceptable and who shouldn't be acceptable. First of all, we should take humans as they are, and they should be afforded those rights that we have decided that all humans have in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And does it matter that it is attached to your citizenship, or is it attached for you as a human? And that, in the legal realm, we've treated mostly that belonging to the citizen itself. But I think that ethically, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, the ethics experts here, right? Ethically, it seems to me that that should belong to the person, not to the citizen, right? So again, does it matter where you belong? I don't think it should. So it's a difficult one, but I think that we need to kind of get the legal folks to kind of expand their interpretation of those rights a little further.
Kathleen, do we have time for one more? Okay, let's take one more. Up in front.
So over the last several 100,000 years that humans have been on this planet, in the instances that climate radically changes in a short period of time, it correlates and connects to diseases becoming exacerbated. So if we see change, we talked about the coral reefs, we see that food supply is affected, livestock's affected, and people have to congregate into denser populated areas. And many scientists understand that this is going to be a precursor to spreads of different diseases, evolutions and changes in different viruses and bacteria. Why do you think this variable and this kind of aspect of the problem of climate migration in which we're going to see diseases is under-discussed, and how can we get it discussed more?
We all had very little questions for you today.
Yeah.
You can take that one first.
Okay, so the global health issue is a messy issue to begin with, right? So, World Health Organization is the house for where global health issues are discussed. And it has come under criticism in its responses to Ebola crisis originally, and then I think that they've come under criticism because of certain aspects of how they responded to the COVID crisis. But then they were able to pick up and respond to it. So it just seems to me that climate and global health, they overlap, and that would be the natural home for the discussion to take place. U.S. is not participating, I believe, right now in the World Health Organization, so that's a concern that one of the biggest countries where health research takes place is abandoning this multilateral forum. So I would say that we have the infrastructure to be able to discuss these issues and to bring attention to those issues. I don't know actually if UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has a global health, but I don't remember, like the Conference of Parties, I don't think has a health realm. So you might be right that migration and health are ignored issues, but don't quote me on that either, so I don't really know. So look it up. If UNFCCC has a area of health, but I don't recall that.
Good. I think this is a really interesting question. So, like the IPCC reports, as I'm sure you've seen, do have some discussion of this, right, in terms of the increase of zoonotic disease in particular, right? That is a slightly different dynamic from, I think, what you were talking about, right? But it's one of the sort of like major human health aspects of climate change is mosquitoes don't care about borders, right? It turns out. But this is, I think, part of a larger set of questions that I think are often marginalized. We tend to focus on displacement and disaster, these kind of like big, highly visible things. But we have more and more people dying every year just from the effects of air pollution. And there was some study. Again, I might be making these numbers up, but I think David Wallace Wells has an article about this where it was like, in one estimate, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming, just if you look at the difference in the total amount of pollutants that are put out into the atmosphere, you're looking at an extra potential 150 million deaths from air pollution, right? It's a huge killer already, disproportionately burdens people in disadvantaged communities. So I think, like, I really appreciate you bringing that in. That's all I think I would want to say about it for right now.
Can I add one more thing that I just thought about really quickly is also, like, when you look at prioritization of research, right? Malaria research is not necessarily prioritized, but we have other research that's prioritized that tend to be like the first world kind of diseases. So in a way, there are certain diseases that will be increasing and they will need attention, but we let the markets decide and where that goes, and the less that the states invest in this, the less public interest there is going to be in there. So that's why I think that I like it when we start to talk about these issues in the context of intergovernmental world, because at least there is some public perspective that is in that space.
Thank you both, and thank you to the audience, both here and online.